the culminating event of our 3-day conference, and we are really gratified and privileged to have several wonderful speakers here discussing the topic, Ukraine after victory. My name is Sarah Phillips. I'm a professor of anthropology at Indiana University, and I'm also the director of the Robert F. Burns Russian and East European Institute. We've had a wonderful 3 days. We've had wonderful panels and roundtables. We've had 2 excellent keynote discussions, and it's been a privilege to highlight the work of the Indiana IU non-residential fellows during the last 3 days of our conference. We'll be putting some links for those of you who aren't aware of our program. You can read about the non-residential scholars and their scholarship and publications. But now I think we should just get started. We have limited time, unfortunately, so I do want to ask our speakers to try to keep your initial remarks brief, hopefully 10 minutes or less, so that we can have a few rounds of discussion. I know that everyone who's attending today has many things to say about Ukraine after victory. We're all working towards the same end, and we all have ideas about what are going to be the most pressing problems after Ukraine's victory, and how we can achieve the goals for rebuilding back Ukraine, both now and tomorrow after victory. So I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker. It is Victoria Amelina. Victoria is a Ukrainian novelist, essayist, and human rights activist based in Kyiv. She's a winner of the Joseph Conrad Literature Prize for her prose works, and excuse me, a finalist of the European Union Prize for Literature. Victoria Amelina is a founder of the New York Literature Festival, which takes place in a small town called New York in the Donetsk region. Due to the full-scale Russian invasion of 2022, instead of the festival, the team launched the Fight Them with Poetry initiative to help supply the Ukrainian army units defending the region. Her prose, poems, and essays have been translated into many languages, and she also teaches a creative writing course, Crafting the Future, at the International Writing Program of the University of Iowa. Since 2022, Victoria has been collaborating with Ukrainian teams to document Russian war crimes and advocate for accountability for the international crimes committed by the Russian Federation and its troops on the territory of Ukraine and other countries. She's now working on a nonfiction project, War and Justice Diary, looking at women, looking at war. And we're so delighted to have you with us today, Victoria Amelina. With your range of expertise, you are really the perfect person to have on this roundtable to discuss Ukraine after victory. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon or good evening to everyone, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm talking to you not from Kyiv, but from Kharkiv this time, and it's very good to be in Kharkiv these days. I can let you know that right now the lights on the streets of Kharkiv are on, and there's no air raid alert on, so we're good here. I will start perhaps with the definition of victory of Ukraine, because this is perhaps the most important thing. I'm sure that everyone here understands that we have to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity, and here one of the next speakers is, for example, Olena Stiazhkina, a Ukrainian writer from Donetsk, and it would be impossible even to even think of giving up Donetsk or Luhansk or Crimea and its people there. So this is the first point. The second point is, of course, completing democratic transformation, because Russia invaded Ukraine exactly because Ukraine chose to be a liberal democracy, and Russia feared that that would be a bad example for Russian people. And of course, it is very important for us to ensure that we have a lasting peace, and that is why it is very important that Ukraine joins NATO. I'm a writer, so I always tell personal stories, and I personally, for me, my son is 11 years old. And I'm sure that if Ukraine does not join NATO after the victory or as part of the victory, I would even define it as part of the victory package. My son will be the next one to join the army and having to fight against Russian invaders. And this doesn't work for me, as you can imagine. So to me, it is very important to ensure that we have real guarantees, not the guarantees that we had with the Budapest Memorandum, but real guarantees that only NATO perhaps can provide. Now that I explained what I see as Ukrainian victory, I will talk about the challenges that I see on the ground, because as Sarah mentioned, I now work as a war crimes researcher, as a field war crimes researcher, and that is the reason why I'm in the Kharkiv region, because I was traveling here to Izum and Donetsk region to research war crimes in the field. And I can tell you that Izum was liberated in September, and I was here in September, and I can see the progress, how these liberated small towns and villages develop after being liberated. So they had their small victory because Ukrainian troops came there, and they're free now. They don't have the pressure of the occupiers. But I can tell you that the thing that is very important for these very simple people, farmers, drivers, teachers, librarians, because obviously I go to libraries a lot. Justice and accountability is very important to them. I come to them not only as a writer, but as a war crimes researcher. And it is very important for them to know that someone cares about what happened to them and their families, and that there is a chance, there is a hope that the perpetrators will be punished according to law. But unfortunately, since the time goes and this doesn't happen, what these people start doing is looking for someone among them to blame, because they do need to blame someone. So of course, you can imagine the dynamics in these communities, because if they cannot find the perpetrators who actually tortured and killed their loved ones, they start looking for possible collaborators among themselves and guessing who might have been those who informed about whereabouts of those who are activists, who are teachers, writers, so people targeted by the occupiers. And this should be stopped, of course. And when we think about transitional justice, what is called about transition from war to peace, it is very important that we have a systematic approach of working with every community in Ukraine to make sure that we don't, leave them like that, because their trauma won't heal if they don't get justice. We had, and again, Olena Stiazhkina is a historian, so it's a part of our history. We had many tragedies, but never, ever in Ukrainian history there was justice. We had Holodomor, and then no one was punished for it. We had all those repressions in the 70s, and then Vasil Stus died, but Medvedchuk became a member of parliament. So we have a history of injustice, and this prevents us from progress. Another challenge I would mention, although it doesn't relate to my field, to war crimes research, is education. Just the day before yesterday, I was in the library and talked to the kids and teens, and I asked them about school. This is a village near Izum. Those kids do not attend school. They cannot attend the school in their native village because, of course, it's not safe. and they also cannot attend schools online. The school works online, but they don't have reliable connection. They also don't have school books. So this is another problem, because you had this during COVID times when the schools were closed and you were all perhaps worried about the quality of education of your kids. But for Ukraine, pandemic situation now evolved into a situation when some of the kids are deprived from school education, or this education continues to be an online one. And this is a huge problem as well. The second problem I would mention is perhaps the mines. I also been to Kherson region in February, and I talked to farmers, and those farmers are eager to resume their work. The spring is coming, so they would like to do their usual job, but their fields are mined, and some of them die trying to explore the fields. So we do need help demining. And my last point would be that all those challenges I mentioned, and perhaps a lot more of them, are not something to just think about. We should take action right now. Right now, we can help those kids to attain school books at least, or maybe attain Wi-Fi connection. I don't know. I will try to buy Starlink for them, and I will bring school books for this particular village. But I cannot, of course, personally help all the villages in Ukraine. But we should be thinking about that right now, because these kids, for example, don't get education right now when they are supposed to. So although we're talking about Ukraine after victory, we should be working on these points, as well as getting weapons for Ukraine and actually winning, which is always the most important point. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Some wonderful points there. We will now turn to David Williams, who is John S. Hastings Professor of Law here at Indiana University's Maurer School of Law, and he's the Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Democracy here at Indiana University. I don't have time to go into his long and very distinguished biography, but I will say that he is a popular lecturer here at Indiana. He's an expert on the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. And he has traveled widely, has consulted with many countries, particularly Burma and Liberia and Vietnam on their constitutional revisions. And he, of late, has been traveling very frequently to Ukraine. And we're very happy to have him speak with us today about Ukraine after victory. Thank you so much, Professor Williams, for being with us.
Sarah, thank you. And Russell and Svetlana, thank you also for inviting me. I'm very proud to be associated with the Ukrainian Studies Association, and I'm very proud to be on a panel with Ukrainian heroes. My message, I'm afraid, is a hard one. I believe Ukraine will win the victory in this war, though it's not completely clear what that means. Ukraine deserves to win the victory in this war because it's fighting a war for civilization on behalf of all of us. And every Ukrainian death is a sacrifice given to the world. But when victory comes, the hard work will not end. In fact, in many ways, it will just be beginning, because in the wake of war, often tragic consequences follow. And victory can be almost as bad for the victors as the vanquished. So in particular, I want to observe the risk here, first, of social fragmentation, once the common enemy is removed. And second, of the hyper-concentration of governmental power in the office of the presidency and in the central government in Kyiv. Now, in some ways, this threat is more difficult to deal with than the invasion because it comes from within rather than from outside. So as Sarah mentioned, I've been a number of times recently to Ukraine. Last October, I was in the country for about a month, and most of that was actually spent on the front lines. I'm just back 2 weeks ago from another trip where I was mostly in the west of the country. And I was asked to come in because a lot of people in Ukraine were concerned that before the invasion, power was hyper-concentrating in a variety of ways. This has always been Ukraine's tendency, and it's a great threat to governmental stability and governmental performance. So they asked what they might be able to do about it. Now, in electoral democracies, people routinely look to personalities, to individuals to save them. The idea is if we just elect the right person, that person will be all wise and all knowing and deeply good and will solve our problems. And that never works out, almost never. So then we elect another person, we hope this person will save us, and that also never works out. And eventually people become disgusted with politics. The reason usually is not that we have these horrible politicians, it's that we have the wrong structure of government, which will keep delivering the same personality type over and over until we change the structure. And usually what that means, again, is the hyper-concentration of power, because this very damaging dynamic gets sets up, which has obviously been at work in Ukraine for a long time. When only a small number of people have power, everybody else looks to them to solve their problems. And in consequence, everybody else tends to throw power at them. Now, those strong leaders then are happy to receive power because they figure they got to save the nation's problems. But precisely because they have so much power, they're unaccountable, they're relatively unchecked. And so government performance never improves. Now, I think this has clearly been the case in Ukrainian elections. Just before the invasion, people were starting to talk seriously, therefore, about structural change. And what happens is Mr. Zelensky, of course, gets elected. He's a complete outsider, and everybody is still hoping that if we bring somebody in from the outside, he'll clean house and everything will get better. And we tend to forget, and it almost feels unpatriotic to observe, that before the invasion, Mr. Zelensky was starting to seem like a very typical Ukrainian politician, and his popularity as a result was going way down. Now, all that's changed because of the war, and I should make clear here, he's just an amazingly great wartime president. That's not the question. The question is what happens when peacetime comes. Because as the invasion has gone on, a number of things have even more hyper-concentrated power in the office of the presidency and in Kyiv. And so the first is Ukraine is now definitively a rentier economy. There's an enormous amount of foreign aid going through the government, and mostly that means through the office of the presidency. Now, that money could be spent to help Ukraine, or it might be spent to help the president's friends and punish the president's enemies. The one thing we know for sure is that it's ramping way up the power of the presidency. Second thing that's happened is this over-the-top popularity of this particular individual, Mr. Zelensky, so that going into peacetime, he's going to be able to do anything he wants to do. Now, if he is utterly pure and with the angels, he'll do exactly the right thing. But of course, nobody is. And history is just full of these accounts of terrific, virtuous, wartime politicians who become peacetime despots. And the biggest favor we can give them is to take that temptation away by restricting the power of the presidency. Now, the third thing is in wartime, power always concentrates. It's inevitable because you need to make quick decisions. You need to make decisive decisions. You need to take action. The fourth thing is international pressure, which right now does not want structural change. They want a hyper-concentration of power because the donor governments think that it's the only way to actually win this war. And they don't want to throw money away on a losing proposition. And then the fifth is a crisis mentality, that when you're in the middle of war, it's totally natural to say, yes, we should deconcentrate power, we should engage in structural change, but we're in a crisis now. Now is not the time to do it. Problem is, Ukraine has been in a crisis at least since 2013. And there is no way of knowing when this period will end, when victory will be definitively achieved. There is some chance that Russia will just give up and go home and declare itself the loser. And if that happens, there will be a moment. But if not, what's going to happen is this war is going to dribble down. And if we stay in a crisis mentality, we'll probably stay in a crisis mentality for good. Now, all of this is hugely dangerous for governance after victory. All of that's compounded by the risk of social fragmentation. Now, on the face of things, you might think that these two tendencies will compensate for each other, that on the one hand, power will concentrate, but on the other hand, society will fragment, which will deconcentrate power. But that's not typically what happens. Typically, what happens is that when there's social fragmentation, people look to a strong government to save them. And they throw even more power at the government to deal with the problem. And the government is typically happy to receive all of that power. Now, down that path lies authoritarianism. And the tragedy here that is waiting to happen is that in this war fought against authoritarianism, there is a not insubstantial chance that Ukraine will actually move into the authoritarian column in the wake of war because of the damage that war does. Now, I'm not going to go into all the possible social fragmentation, but let me just observe, everybody now believes that victory here, real victory, means retaking the Crimea and Donbass. But those areas, of course, have been subjected to unrelenting Russian propaganda for years and years and years. And they will be enormously difficult to incorporate back into Ukraine. And we certainly should imagine a more fragmented politics, and we might even imagine local violence occurring in those regions. And that's difficult for any government to deal with, but in the wake of war, it's enormously difficult. Okay. Now, the answer to all of this is, in my view, one of the necessary pieces to an answer to all of this is structural change, that what we would need here is constitutional reform. And that has to happen now rather than later, because later it'll be too late. Once power starts to concentrate, then the country will become more and more derailed. And so it's time to focus on this now. Now, that's hugely difficult to do in the midst of this. Everyone is exhausted. What they want is a well-deserved rest. But in fact, what is necessary now is to take action. Now, luckily, some people are thinking about that, and some people are moving in that direction. And that's terrific. But it's also a really hard sell at this moment because there are built-in structural resistances to structural change. Some of those come from within Ukraine itself. I think, compared to the rest of the world, Ukrainians tend to be fairly realistic about Mr. Zelensky. He's a great wartime president. We're not sure what's going to happen in peacetime. But at the same time, mostly Ukrainians think that when you're in an existential war, you need a very strong leader. And so there's a hesitation to talk about structural reform to reduce the power of the presidency, even if those reforms did not actually take place until after victory. The other difficulty is, inevitably, to deal with the Crimea and the Donbass, we're going to need to talk about decentralization. But right now in Ukraine, all of that has a very bad name because it's thought to be a code word for Russian subversion. And so there will be reluctance to make concessions to local government in those areas. The other problem, and I was not really aware of this until this last trip, is actually the United States. Everybody in Ukraine is really desperate to keep the United States happy because there's a sense of being existentially dependent on United States armaments provision. And the United States has been sending very clear signals that they do not want to rock the boat. They just want to stay the course. They don't want to change anything. We have found our guy, that's Mr. Zelensky. But of course, we say the same thing about Arab kings in the Gulf. We tend to pick a leader that we then back. And what's going on is America's not thinking about the welfare of Ukrainians in 5 or 10 years, I'm afraid. They're thinking about how to win this war. Now, that's a self-serving agenda, but it's also going to be self-defeating because it's super short-sighted. That if, in fact, as I say, this becomes only a way to push back against Russia rather than a battle for humane values, then the United States will have lost as well as everyone else. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. Very sobering scenarios, but very important to think about and talk about. I'll introduce our next speaker on this roundtable, Ukraine After Victory. She's Olena Stiazhkina. She's a Ukrainian writer, publicist, doctor of history, and professor of history. She's a senior research fellow at the Department of History of Ukraine in the second half of the 20th century at the Institute of History of Ukraine of the National Academy of Sciences. She was formerly professor of the Department of Slavic History at Vasil Stus Donetsk National University. Olena Stiazhkina is the founder of a nonprofit and a movement, really, called De-Occupation Return Education. There's many more things that I could say about Olena, but I will let her take the floor.
Дякую за представлення і дякую за
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you that this conference is happening. I'd like to thank the Indiana University and all the speakers that today, yesterday, the day before yesterday, talked about Ukraine, talked about the inevitability of our victory and the challenges that are related to it. If I may, in my brief presentation, I will start the discussion, if you're okay with this. I would like to talk today about some of the discussable threats that the world is being threatened with, these challenges also by some of the Western intellectuals, and how they are dealing with some internal challenges that we discussed today. So one of such threats that Ukraine is threatened after victory is the danger of militarization or militarism. It's a weird thing because many people who come, intellectuals who come from the West, talk at different platforms, different positions, including in the front line. For some reason, they're asking themselves, why are you supporting the army so much? Why are you in such an awe of your army? How did this happen? And for some reason, it seems to them a signal that we are moving towards awful militarism. This is true. Every event starts with saying that we're grateful to the Ukrainian army for the possibility to leave and to have conferences. This is how we start our day, and this is how we end our day. But what militarism, militarization means when it is distributed through the Western media, I think it looks like repeating some Kremlin messages. Even before the full-scale war, during the hybrid war, the Western intellectuals were saying that Ukrainian nationalism is Nazism. So now they started repeating the next idea that special operation, so-called, is being carried out to demilitarize Ukraine, but Ukraine wants to be a military state. This is an absolute trap for thinking about our future. And if we talk about militarization, it will take place. It is not a threat in a way, but a guarantee, because on our borders, we will have something that's left from the Russian Federation, or what the Russian Federation will become. We don't know the configuration there. But the fact is that we have a border not with China and not with some other democratic state. It will be relevant for some point. So militarization is a necessary component of our future Ukraine after victory, because we continue to have Russia at our borders. Also, the way we look at militarization is a little bit different from Western intellectual looking at it, and entirely different from what the Kremlin says about it. Ukraine prepared for the security conference the result of the sociological study. 80% of men and women said they are ready to protect their state with arms in hand. So if you're talking about militarization, this is the sign of it. People being ready to protect their country and take arms for it. It's a very important number that evidences the fact that Ukraine's future will be like this, whether people like it or not. It cannot be different.
певної міри.
But I have good news as well. As the previous year showed us, ability or being ready to protect the country with weapons was the main aspect behind the success, not the government, not Zelensky, not his office, but the people who were ready to protect the country. So this is why we're attacking. This is why we're saying thank you our armed forces, not thank you president, not thank you our government. And here's the interesting thing. Sometimes you want to delegate all the decision making on someone, but I'm not sure if that's going to be done for the person who's the president right now. The second challenge, speaking about militarization, of course, now we have experience. I hope nobody in the world will have, but we have this experience. We have experience of evacuation. We have experience that is good and bad. We have experience of getting people from under fire. And hopefully nobody's going to get that experience. And that would be still our advantage, if you will. We'll have trainings, we'll have everything, we'll have this industrial military complex, and this is our protection. And this is our drive for the future. My second story is about international organization in a world where Ukraine is victorious. International organization who were incapable of responding to the war. We should talk about that. And when the aggressor is part of the Security Council in the UN is outrageous, because this organization works for taxpayers. So money from the taxpayers, they are diverted for the support of the aggressor. And with due respect, the activities of International Red Cross, they haven't reached Olenivka, they haven't reached all these horrible places where we have lots of prisoners of war from Ukraine. Same thing with OSCE that's been present on occupied territories in Luhansk Oblast. Well, what's then? So all of that system, all that international system, all of that system that gave hope to the world, it didn't work. And if it's going to be revised and changed, we have no position to talk about security, world security. Next story. Another challenge is the narrative that Ukrainians are not going to get back home. We're talking about millions of people, and that's a huge catastrophe, and so on and so forth. And it's also a narrative that's being promoted by Kremlin, but it's a problem, a challenge, and a possibility at the same time. Since 18th century, Ukrainian history develops in two different directions: Ukrainian society and Ukrainian diaspora. It's very hard to imagine where we would be without Ukrainian diaspora. Those governments who help us today. And if Ukrainian citizens don't get back, they will remain Ukrainian diaspora, traditional Ukrainian diaspora. We can benefit from that as well. So you should think about that. You should think about that not just as a challenge, The next thing I want to talk about is traumatic disorder. People on the front line, they will uh, have traumatic disorders, but let's take a wider perspective on that. Ukrainian society as a whole is a part of a huge trauma. And since we all came from the Soviet Union, and our perception of disorders and psychological problems are at the same level. In our society, we don't have a habit of talking about that. We don't have a habit of talking about our mental problems, and people are silent about it. They're silent about their children who survived in basements, people on the front line. But this is what we need. We need teams of people who can help us with these disorders and with post-traumatic disorders. It's actually not post-traumatic disorder. We are in the process of trauma. We need people who you can complain to. It's like you can't talk about that you're feeling bad because everybody's feeling bad. We need people who can help us with that. Another thing, after our victory, and I have a fear of that in international practice context. I'm afraid that we will be in a situation where it's better to be a maniac than a victim. Well, how it happened when he became a maniac, like they had Pushkin, they had Tolstoy. So it turned out that people are ready to talk about pathology more than about a norm. We need to be aware that our existence in the world that is backed by our soldiers on the front line, it should be the same as today. We have our own place in history, our own self-presentation, self-consciousness, self-perception. If these new victims of Putin dictatorship come in tears, you have to be careful about this in order not to let these cannibals in where they don't belong. The last thing I'd like to mention is how hard it is to be at Donetsk and Luhansk. Of course, it's going to be hard in Crimea and all these places. But with Victoria, with all of our visits to the East since the war started, we can reassure it's not going to be that hard, despite the years of propaganda, despite the fact that Kremlin didn't let people go and they filled their brains with utter nonsense. It's not going to be that hard. Maybe you heard that example, but sorry, I'm a person who was born in the Soviet Union. I was in the Young Pioneer Organization. I was in the Young Communist Organization. And I had a pretty good behavior. Somehow I ended up being a part of that organization. I gave my oath, gave my Young Pioneer promise. I quoted Marx, Lenin, just like all other people who studied in Soviet Union. Doesn't mean that I won't change. It doesn't mean that you have to ignore me and you have to do the same to other people. Of course not. it's evident that we can change, and we can change with other people, with the rest of the people. It's not going to be easy in Donetsk and Luhansk, but I know that there are people who are waiting for Ukraine, and there are people who are just tired, and they just don't care who's coming. And there are people who will just open their eyes and they will just realize that I was wrong to wear that young pioneer's scarf and that uniform. So to sum it up, yeah, there will be lots of challenges and the needs for other victories after we win. But when we talk about David and Goliath, and we talk about David as just a small kid who won over this huge machine, we don't realize that David was the one who to create the city of Jerusalem, that he had to work on that to create this big state. If we are talking about a wonder in the biblical sense, I'm going definitely to remember that story, David and Goliath. And if we deserve that, it's going to happen, and let it happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olena. I'll introduce our final speaker on this roundtable, and that is Nastya Melnychenko. Nastya is an activist and author who writes on social, historical, and cultural issues. She's very well known as the co-founder of Studena, a nonprofit human rights organization, and also as the initiator of the hashtag Я не боюсь сказати, I'm not afraid to say it, social media campaign in 2016, which was a precursor to the Me Too movement. Nastya received her bachelor's degree at the Institute of Journalism of the Taras Shevchenko National University, and she also earned a master's degree with distinction in archaeology and history of Ukraine at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And as far as I'm aware, Nastya right now is a visiting scholar at Princeton University. So Nastya, it's an honor to have you on this roundtable, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and let me share my screen. I have a couple of slides to show. Oh my gosh, oh, I don't have, it disappeared somewhere. Okay, I will be without slides. I'm afraid I somehow missed this. Okay. So yes, victory in the armed war is not enough. As a visiting scholar at Princeton, I'm developing a systematic approach to combat bullying in Ukrainian schools. One aspect of this work is to analyze the impact of divisive messages related to the war and refugee experience on the formation of new pretext for bullying and discrimination. Studying divisive messages showed that a significant part of them is inspired by Russian propaganda and is a tool of hybrid aggression. We can predict that this aggression will continue even after the active armed conflict stops and will persist as long as the Russian Federation exists. The possible change of Putin as a ruler doesn't necessarily mean the aim to eliminate Ukraine will change. The Russian society, not just its leaders, demands the destruction of Ukraine. This can be seen from the fact that more people in Russia support the escalation of the war than the total population of Ukraine. And here I take the data from Levada Center and Russian Field Center. It was on my slide, but I don't know how to launch it. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Thus, winning the armed war alone is not enough. We need to win the information war as well. This war, among other tasks, is aimed to split Ukrainian society and to prevent Ukraine from being a country with democratic values. To rebuild Ukraine, we need people. The most important task for Ukraine after the victory is to stay united in being inclusive and safe so that people feel comfortable living and flourishing in the country. But where do we find these people and what makes them choose Ukraine? According to the UN, 8.1 million people have officially left Ukraine due to the full-scale invasion, with 86% being women and children. By the time the active phase of the war ends, Women and children will likely have spent more than a year and a half abroad. They will have found jobs and permanent housing. Their children will be in school. When Ukraine becomes safe to return to and opens its borders, we will face counter waves of people. Some men will want to reunite with their families outside Ukraine, while some women and children will return home. However, we are still determining what the demographic balance of this movement will be. Our goal in rebuilding Ukraine is to attract people who are willing to help, not just Ukrainians, but people from all backgrounds. We want to create a diverse and inclusive society that welcomes different languages, ethnicities, and religions. This will encourage refugees to return to Ukraine and inspire non-Ukrainians to contribute to the rebuilding efforts. Unfortunately, Russia has been using propaganda to destabilize Ukraine and justify its invasion, especially intensively since the war began in 2014. Not only this, but they also have been polarizing and marginalizing Ukrainian society, spreading internal division and discord. Their objective is to create confusion and distract from the main Ukrainian goal of overcoming the imperialistic Russian legacy, as well as to split Ukrainian society. According to CAT-UA NGO, an analysis of the media environment showed that all divisive topics that split the unity of Ukrainian society on social media were supported and amplified by Russian or pro-Russian accounts. The most divisive message was directed against Ukrainian refugees and internally displaced persons, IDPs. Over 85 million people were reached by the top 100 posts on this topic. A TikTok video aimed at stirring up intolerance towards refugees by blogger MeVoice.ua alone had an organic reach of 1.8 million, not including reposts on other platforms like Facebook. This became the most popular divisive topic on Ukrainian social media. On the topic of refugees, Russians were involved in spreading stories about the ingratitude and arrogance of refugees and their bad behavior abroad, and the wealth of refugees who left Ukraine, saying that they were not real refugees, but used the war as an excuse to flee to wealthier countries. Such messages contrast refugees with so-called real Ukrainians who didn't leave. According to our research, most respondents experience strong negative emotions when reading such messages. The most frequent emotion is vexation, followed by sadness, then outrage, anger, judgment, guilt, and insult. So all emotions are negative. According to CAT-UA's analysis of Facebook posts and the language used, indignation and anger are the two predominant emotions in posts on divisive topics. Through intense emotions, such messages bypass the ability of the psyche to look at them critically. As a result, Russian hate messages can undermine Ukraine's ability to be inclusive and united. As Ukraine faces an influx of new experiences and cultures from abroad, it also has to contend with divisive messages. Additionally, the country will see many people with visible and hidden disabilities, acquired through direct experience of war, trauma, and loss. Russia may exploit these differences to try to divide Ukraine. What do our enemies want by this divisive information campaign? First of all, it's radicalization. It's rejection of otherness, loss of unity in confronting the enemy, to make refugees afraid to return home because they will face hate and condemnation as not real Ukrainians, to spread the belief that Ukraine is intolerant to otherness. And therefore, inclusiveness should be a top priority for Ukraine in the coming decade. While Ukraine has made significant progress in providing convenient services and creating a human-centered business environment, there is still more work to be done to create an inclusive society. To counteract divisive messages and build inclusivity, Ukraine needs to focus on better organization, education, outreach, and communication, as well as creation of the vision of future Ukrainian society. This includes implementing educational programs, developing information policies, ensuring a free press, promoting cultural diversity, and fostering expert development. The gap between Ukraine and Russia is growing as Ukrainians become more comfortable with freedoms, self-determination, decentralization, and democracy. At the same time, the political nation of Russians has been inclined since the Middle Ages to autocracy, so-called samodержавие. It's when the Tsar's power is not limited at all. Then it's superiority over other nations and colonization of territorial neighbors. Almost 1,300 kilometers of common border with Russia remain our challenge to defense with armor, but alongside we should protect a much bigger border in the information front of divisive propaganda. In a historically short time, we must be so far ahead of the enemy in terms of civilization that this advantage will protect us at all levels: symbolic, semantic, economic, and security. Ukrainians should realize their long-held desire for an inclusive society that is attractive not only to them, but also to people in the democratic world who share our values. A sign that this is happening would be a mother with children who have settled abroad or may live there in the future, but still want to return to a country where everyone is accepted and can feel at home. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nastya, for these really important thoughts on inclusivity, inclusion, how to build a tolerant society. And I know that I mentioned that we want to have as many participants as possible participate in this discussion about Ukraine after victory. But before we open up the floor to the wider audience, I'd like to give each of the roundtable participants a chance to maybe highlight just one or two key points that, after having heard the other speakers, you'd like to return to or respond to. So we'll go in the order that the speakers presented. So Victoria, Amelina, if you'd like to just highlight one or two things.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like perhaps to mention decentralization. First of all, decentralization reform has been quite successfully completed before the full-scale invasion. And I have to say that decentralization is not a word that is somehow controversial in Ukraine. We love decentralization. And basically, successful decentralization reform allowed many communities survive in the occupation. Because in the time when there was no connection, there was no, nothing, no electricity, no gas, and occupiers in your village or a small town, the decentralization allowed those communities to survive, because if the community had a good mayor, a caring mayor, a lot of mayors, by the way, were very successful at that, and they cared about the community, and they went above and beyond to make sure their community is safe. Those communities suffered less losses. Well, of course, it depended on aggressor mostly, but still, it was easier to evacuate people, even though the occupiers didn't allow evacuation, but to sneak people out of the village, etc., etc. So right now, people really understand how they depend on each other, and this is very important, but also on their local authorities. So decentralization will work even better, because right now they know that if they had a bad mayor, they suffered much more. I'd like to basically applaud a topic about how we concentrate on the maniacs. Because every time I travel to the front line, but I also travel to speak at the international events, and every time I enter any bookstore, I count the books about Ukraine and about Russia, and you can basically check yourself that for every book about Zelensky, there are 3 books about Putin or something like that. But again, also the third topic I'd like to mention, I also, just like Olena, I don't think that authoritarian regime is possible in Ukraine. It might seem from the outside that Zelensky is the key factor for success. He's important. He's a good wartime president right now. But we do see who liberates, people do see who liberates them. And these are the soldiers. People do see who supplies the army. So we do understand that it's us who are doing all those things. And I have to remind you that Ukraine is a country with a history of colonial powers. So we have another problem. For us, government, we are always in opposition. Once someone becomes part of the government, we are already preparing to protest and get to the Maidan. So on the contrary, right now I'm seeing how finally civil society is collaborating with the government, and this is a good process. Finally, some people who always thought that they would remain in the civil society and work only as a civil society leader, they decided to join the government, because right now we should all come together. So if we'll see, and I can tell you that there are a lot of talks among Ukrainian intellectuals about the downsides of Zelensky's government, about what we have with the freedom of speech, etc. right now on the television. So we just don't say it aloud mostly because it's a wartime, and as you said, but we are in control, and we know we're in control. And Ukraine will remain a liberal democracy. It's absolutely impossible that Ukrainians will let anyone to be a dictator here. Thank you.
Victoria, thank you. Thank you so much. Pass the word to you, David. 1 or 2 points.
Thank you. So first, I agree totally. Decentralization has been successful in Ukraine. Ukrainians are really good at that, and they've seen the benefits of it. The big issue, I think, come peacetime, though, is not going to be small scale, very local decentralization. It's going to be regional decentralization. It's going to involve Crimea and the Donbass. That's going to be the really thorny problem. Now, another word for that is federalism, which is, in fact, a dirty word in Ukraine. Nobody wants to say federalism. The second thing about authoritarianism, one of the things that's really striking to me is that we should be aware that wartime is unbelievably damaging to everybody, and it actually exponentially increases the risk of authoritarianism, but in a way that we often can't anticipate. But yes, what's amazing about Ukraine right now is there are people worried about authoritarianism, worried about what's coming. That's why I've been there the last couple of times. In the midst of war, people are thinking, what's coming after and what can we do now? And I really hope those efforts are successful. I really, really do. So that's the second part. The third thing that I would like to comment on is the discussion about trauma, which for me is just terribly moving. I've been doing so much work in Burma, which is a country that has been at war since 1947, and nobody talks about trauma there. And in fact, since my time in Ukraine, where everybody talks about trauma, I've been talking with them about it. So this has had a direct kind of influence in that situation. Now, the reason is they've been at war since 1947. And so the trauma is just a fact of life. It's just part of the background. I don't know how much damage it has done in Burma. And that is now what I'm trying to puzzle out. What's amazing about Ukraine, again, is that Ukrainians know this is happening. They know the spiritual damage that can be wrought by this, and they're trying to get ahead of the curve and see what they can do about it. And again, this is just months after the invasion, in the midst of an existential war. So this certainly is one of the things that any kind of post-war settlement will really have to be thinking about. It's just astonishing that Ukrainians are talking about it now.
Thank you, David. Olena, Stiazhkina, what would you like to offer? 1 or 2 points?
Я хочу зробити акцент, мабуть, на
I would like to emphasize on the fact that we are trying to thank every day, not just the army. We are thanking our partners, people that we see in the street, people that we are helping the army with, and this culture of gratitude. This is something that is very new for Ukraine's history, for society with colonial history. So we are not just thanking our people, our families, but also external partners. And it means that the world after the victory is not going to be hostile for us. There will be an enemy on the other side of the border, but the world is not going to be hostile for us. And I think that's very important. It's a very big advantage that our young people have. But now it's evident that people of any age can benefit from that. So the world is not hostile, not dangerous anymore. And I've been thinking about that. What happens after the victory?
And the second thing that I wanted to say, to add to what Victoria said previously, let's say the truth. Our tractor troops is a result of decentralization. Those are men, those are boys, young men who were in the communities, in the amalgamated territorial communities, and they took to being partisans. They organized themselves into units. They did not need a command from the top. They did not need a general, an order. They were already taught a little bit with a story of decentralization, a brief story that they can take defending of their own villages in their own hands. I think it's also a sign that decentralization was somewhat successful. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Pass the word now to Nastya Melnychenko.
Дякую дуже. Я буду говорити українською. Мені так легко. Я не знаю.
Thank you very much. I'll be speaking Ukrainian. It's easier for me. I don't know this was an option. I would like to answer the presentation of Olena Stiazhkina, who is rather optimistic, talking about people leaving the country. I also mentioned this, and I'm much more pessimistic about this because we were in demographic crisis even before the war started. If we look at the data, there's data from State Statistical Office, and if we look at their reports, we basically have minuses when population growth is mentioned. So we're deeply in the demographic crisis. So again, when we were counting together with the partner, the number of people who left from Ukraine because of the war, if we counted the percentage, the numbers, we compared the data of the budget committee, their calculations as of beginning of the year, and tried to calculate based on UN data how many people left. And the percentage is awful. It's as awful that the presentation that I was not able to launch, I did not include it because I thought it shouldn't be shown. It's catastrophic. I think that UN probably was documenting when people were leaving at first a lot, but they did not see who came back. But if you look at the data that's available now, the percentage is just awful. I don't have anything against the diaspora. Diaspora is great. I see how here in Philadelphia, diaspora does some incredible things. It's very important. We rely on them very much, but we also need to rebuild the country with someone and for someone. There must be people inside. And if you take into account how many people left, it looks very sad indeed. We understand that with the internal market, like in this state, our business will also not be able to develop the way it should. And for me, it's a big issue. This is why I'm not as optimistic as the others are. Thank you very much. May I respond to that? Yeah,
Sure.
I'm also not very optimistic either. I just suggest to look at the problem as an opportunity. I suggest not to have this catastrophic thinking. I suggest not to take this traumatizing effect. If people don't want to come back, we can take a million of billions of grants, but people will not be coming back anyway. So this is a story that something that we can do and something that we can't. So when we can do something, we must do everything that we can. But in the areas where we can't influence the situation, we need to understand how we make this challenge into an advantage. This is my optimism. Thank you very much. I think that all of us are traumatized. Of course, we have catastrophic thinking. It's a normal reaction of our psyche. And at the same time, I think that we can develop some kind of a strategy how we could be bringing those people back. Because even talking, I know that it's not, a study yet. We have not carried out this study, what Ukrainians think about this. But I think that even at the level of everyday observations, we see that there are certain conditions that are good or not good for the refugees. And I would like us to build this vision of the country that we will be moving towards in the future after the victory.
Thank you. Victoria, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in on both on depopulation danger and federalization as a dirty word, because here I agree actually. So regarding depopulation, I'll say a brave thing that I have a dream. I'd like foreigners to come and immigrate to Ukraine, and this would partially solve the problem. Right now, we are like predominantly Ukrainian, predominantly white, etc., etc. I'd like to see Kyiv as I don't know, as a brave dream, as an alpha city, that it would look like New York or London, and we would be able to meet people of all cultures there, that it would be beneficial to come there because this is a city of opportunities, and Kharkiv, for example, could be a city of opportunities. So this is my vision, and I'd like to see it this way. And then Ukrainians would come back as well, seeing all that. So I invite everyone here to consider immigration to Ukraine. I totally agree with David that federalization, it has become a dirty word just because it was used. It was kind of reprogrammed by Russian propaganda because it was used during Russian aggression in 2014. And I remember my relatives from the Donetsk region telling me, but we are for federalization. And I was like, what do you mean? And the only thing they wanted was that the money would stay in the region. They didn't realize that the region wasn't that it required donations, in fact. But anyway, they were talking about decentralization, not about federalization. This is exactly what they wanted. And after 2014, ironically, the decentralization reform happened on all the territory of Ukraine, except those cities and Crimea. So yes, but this is just a terminology, and it could be overcome by just talking to people. And both, all of us here, I guess, we have a dream of coming to Vasil Stus Donetsk University, where Olena used to work, Luhansk National University, and being able to talk to students there and talk to them. And basically, I'm sure that quite quickly we would be on the same page. Thank you.
So this so far has been just an excellent conversation. I would like to invite others to take part. Any of our attendees who would like to contribute, please raise your hand, and then we'll call you one by one to contribute, or you can put your questions in the chat. So we have Oleksiy Kondyuk, please, the floor is yours.
Доброго вечора чи дня всім там в залежності від часу.
Good evening, good afternoon, depends on your time zone. Thank you very much to the organizers. I have had great pleasure during these 3 days, but indeed this roundtable was probably the most interesting, at least for me, as a person specializing in political scientist. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Olena Stiazhkina, for the inspirational words. All the Ukrainians need it in these times. We can hope that after the war, it's not at least worse than before the war, and I hope that it will be even better.
I'm, as a political scientist, must regretfully agree that with most of the argument of the professor regarding to the trends toward centralization and threatening of power in Ukraine after the end of the war, and especially in the fact that one of the recipes can be the reform of the power with the slight movement maybe to the parliamentary republic and even more transfer of powers to regional authorities. But the question in this regard is this: in your opinion, can one of the way to avoid such a gloomy prospects be the perspectives of Ukraine membership in the European Union? I mean, can the passing through all these necessary procedures transform the system of power in Ukraine? Can the institutions be the answer in this case, in your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great question. Unfortunately, what the EU has been pushing on is anti-corruption measures. And by that, they mean very close to the ground, kind of judicially administered measures, not the large-scale deconcentration of power. And they've been pushing to some extent on individual rights, but individual rights are never successful unless you get the balance of power right, and they're really not focusing on that. And of course, Hungary is some evidence that the EU is just never going to be serious about the hyper-concentration of power. So one hopes, yes, that it can be of some assistance, but I wouldn't place a lot of real hope in it. I just don't think they're as realistic as they need to be. And to be honest, for the EU to try to directly intervene and say, you should be a Westminster style government rather than a presidential style government, that reeks of imperialism. They're both perfectly good styles of government. It's just you got to select the right one for the right country. So I don't know whether there's going to be enough pressure there. I will say I was struck, though, when I was there about how many people asked me, would the US condition continued armed support on constitutional reform? And of course, I don't work for the State Department, so I can't answer that at all. But what I really want to say is that's a really dangerous road to go down. That, Ukrainians are going to have to decide if they want parliamentary government, that they're going to want it on their own, rather than probably this coming through outside intervention. But that's just my thought.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Natalia Shulga, please.
I cannot find the best word to congratulate the organizers on this unbelievable conference, and I hope it will continue in the next year and year after year. So it would be annual event at Indiana University. It looks like you found a very good support for this idea. What I would like to mention to participants, which was overlooked during this conference, it is education. And unfortunately, this is reality of Ukraine. Everybody noticed decentralization reform and its success. And nobody noticed that the second successful reform which started with education and science reform. And it goes together. And because of decentralization, we could improve the secondary education. And money were given to start doing this extremely important reform. And what we observe in Ukraine, that there is still resistance and still misunderstanding on behalf of teachers and university professors and the whole administration body of the higher education. Look at our scandals at the Ministry of Education and Science. It's not a joke, actually. It's a tragedy. But anyway, but it was started. And for those pessimists who believe that we are losing people, I just want to give examples of such a small countries like Finland, for example, which has the population of Kiev city, okay, and didn't stop them to change societal understanding. What means to be a great nation? What means to have internal solidarity? What means to bring people to happiness? So it's not amount of people who made it happen. It's a quality of education which produce societal solidarity in terms of building a new country, new societal agreement. And I think that's what is so important. And I am very pleased to hear what Olena Stiazhkina is saying. Being a victim, right, of all of that invasions of Russian Federation, she's not look like victim. She is still looking for positive solutions, for the positive ways of thinking and doing things. So my question to all speakers on this final panel, what do you think Ukraine will need today, tomorrow, and the next years to speed up, to accelerate this process of reforms in order to build the great new quality nation, which will keep its position on the world map? What should be this acceleration moment? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Do any of our speakers want to jump in and respond to this particular question before we move on?
Sarah, so I guess I would just add,
Sure.
when we look at other countries, there's incredible unity right now in Ukraine and incredible patriotism. And of course, there was in the American Revolution as well. I mean, in many ways, this war is Ukraine's birth moment. The question is how to take that unity in wartime and retain it in peacetime, retain what it means to be Ukrainian, retain the idea of Ukraine to help sustain this during a time that will become more internally difficult. And I don't know the answer to that, but that, it seems to me, is the great question, right? Don't let this vitiate. Use this in a way that will help then. And the key thing is not just to think about now, but as your question suggested, a year from now, and 5 years from now, and even 10 years from now.
Thank you, David. As we continue to, someone else wanted to jump in, please.
У мене є відповідь, вона
I have an answer, a little bit of a joke, not a joke at the same time. I would probably adopt a law on the right to carry arms. I think that this is the story that's same as in some of the states of the United States. It balanced out the situation with accelerated reforms. It could also accelerate the reforms in Ukraine as well. Thank you very much.
I can't resist the opportunity to have David jump in on this, as he is an expert on the Second Amendment in the United States, and anyone else who's attending who would like to weigh in on this question of the right to bear arms. So David.
So that's a rifle carried by one of my ancestors in the Revolutionary War, carried to resist unjust, governmental authority. So I keep it there because I've been working with Burmese resistance groups now for 22 years, who take up arms to defend their liberties. So this is in fact close to my heart. And I utterly agree, the right to arms has nothing to do with self-defense. It has everything to do with the relative balance of power. And I think it's a really complicated subject. What I will say, though, is I was just stunned this last time in Ukraine. Everybody's talking about this, about the right to arms as a kind of a psychological balance against the government, that the very fact that the government will allow you to own guns kind of rights the balance. And I should add, I own 27 functioning firearms. I take full advantage of America's lax firearms policies. And I just never thought that I'd find another country like the United States in which people so fervently talked about this, especially on the European continent, where they think people, by and large, people in America are crazy for believing that you should have a right to arms. And a big part of the discussion when I was just there was, should Ukraine become more like America or more like Europe? And of course, my answer always was, Ukraine should become more like Ukraine. And it's a big mistake to think about simple models. But part of what was driving the idea of moving in an American direction was the whole right to arms. So I'm not going to observe more than that, except to say it is striking the way the themes are common in both places.
May I jump in as a Ukrainian who owns a shotgun? So actually, it's not so difficult to get a permission to buy a gun in Ukraine right now. So I don't think we need any reform, but maybe more information, because in the raise of concerns about the upcoming invasion, basically I just obtained the permission to buy a gun, and I only had to, pass medical, etc., etc. So it's just a matter of control who buys arms, and it seems to me that important checks are necessary. And I'm also speaking as a person who lived in Massachusetts and have these views on Second Amendment, perhaps. So I am for Ukrainians having guns, but I'm also still for having checks who buys firearms. And I also can tell you that people found out how to buy guns in February and March 2022, because I could see those long lines to the gun shops. Men and women who weren't that smart like me, who bought the gun in February, in the beginning of February, they had to stand in long lines to buy their guns for self-defense against Russians, of course, in March 2022. So I think we are on the right track here. But answering the question, what we need to succeed, I would rather mention support of civil society organization, which we have, but the most important thing is independent media and independent television, because one of the biggest problems in post-Soviet Ukraine was that all the major television channels were owned by oligarchs, were owned by pro-Russian oligarchs. So although Ukrainian civil society is vibrant and great, but we could only use the social media means to find each other, because television were owned by a few oligarchs. So it's very important for us to have our television and radio stations which are independent and well-funded.
That's a great point, Victoria. Thank you. I'll mention that there's a discussion in the chat right now. I won't read the discussion, but you can look. It's in Ukrainian about refugees abroad, about public attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees and how those may or may not be changing. Maria Zubritska, please, you've been very patient with your question, so please, the floor is yours.
No, I don't have a question. I would like to thank very much to the participant, and I like very much the category of in-betweenness, between optimistic point of view and pessimistic, between two generations or even three generations of Ukrainians. Everyone in Ukraine knows that Ukrainian society is far ahead than Ukrainian government and Ukrainian politicians. And that is why I completely share the opinion of Professor Williams about wrong structure of governing. And it is very needed, very timely, and we should think about at this moment, even during the war. Another, we have successful decentralization reform, but please, do you remember the accident with the mayor of Chernihiv? And it is about power concentration. and we should think about as well. It is very needed to keep a balance between society responsibility and government. And last example, it is about Nastya pessimistic point of view. India, Bangalore. Nastya, do you know that 15,000 of IT engineering scientists came from United States, came back from United States to India and established Bangalore, the second Silicon Valley, and produced a lot of jobs and became like a dream for the future. It is about what Victoria, crafting the future. We should, during the war, to think about this crafting of the future of Ukraine. So thank you very much, Olena Stiazhkina, for your optimism. Very needed. And I believe that Ukrainian society will be able to overcome all challenges and threats, but solidarity is needed. But post-war situation is different, and Professor Williams emphasizes on this problem. Thank you very much. It is very interesting, very needed, and very productive roundtable.
Thank you, Maria. Nastya, would you like to jump in and respond, or do you have anything else you'd like to offer? You're muted, Nastya. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not so pessimistic. I'm just talking about that. To be optimistic, we should create this vision of future Ukraine. So it's not like it's no solution, no way out of this situation. No, it is. But we just need to have maybe more roundtables to find this shared vision of what should be done to bring these people back, like in your example with India. Thank you so much for this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Nastya. Our time is getting short, but if folks are willing to stay around, I think this is a terrific roundtable, a really stimulating conversation. I'm learning so much, and I'd love to continue it. So are there any of our other participants, particularly the IU Ukraine non-residential scholars? I know the discussions here about education, about tolerance have really resonated with many of your research projects. Language use, we haven't talked that much about language. I'll note that unless I'm mistaken, I believe that Olena Stiazhkina took the very public and bold step of abandoning the Russian language for Ukrainian, as I understand. Please tell me if I'm wrong, but I'd love to hear about that experience for you, and if anyone else wants to talk about language issues. So here's your chance to please jump into the conversation. Anyone in the educational sphere? Natalia Shulga, you mentioned that we hadn't focused so much on education in our conference. We did have one panel on challenges in Ukrainian education. But you're right, we could have talked more about educational reform and what we might expect going forward.
Well, I mention it because unfortunately, for those years of the independence, education and science were not a priority in a country. And it caused a lot of damage for the system. And that's why necessity of change and kind of rethinking the whole, and creating a system which would be efficient. Because what we have now, it's not really a good system. In my comparative studies, it shows that there is no a single country in the world which was successful in the past 50 years, which would not put education and research as the first priority, because that's the foundation. There is no such thing as an economy built on knowledge if you don't have that backed by excellent access of education, for education and research. There is no such examples, and it was overlooked. And in my mind, when I came back in 2005, what I observed, to me, it was like somebody is working against Ukraine and its future by doing what they do in education and research. How possibly it can come to reality that you can buy a diploma of higher education in Ukraine? When plagiarism became like a norm, it's like you have to find where you will not have a plagiarism, the text, I think like, in my mind, it was somebody's doing it on purpose. So that's why I was the enemy of the government all the time, because I was bringing this question, because you're ruining the whole country. Because if you don't have the excellent things in education and research, you don't have a future, and nobody could really understand me. And because it became kind of norm. So I think why it's so important, and why it's so important to start from kids, preschool, secondary education, and then the future higher education and research. Because that's the foundation for change. If you are not able to change in that domain, it's very problematic to talk about, industry, Silicon Valleys, and things like that. It comes to the point that it's less and less people who even can understand what we're talking about. Because if you lose competencies, that's what you have. You have imitation, and imitation cannot produce anything. And the whole world is working on producing new knowledge, new technologies, new marvels in health industry. Look what happened with COVID. Without science and this readiness to present absolutely new ways of attacking the virus, I'm talking about RNA vaccine, we would not be able to overcome that unbelievable to the world. So that my point is that we need to pay more attention, and everything depends, again, everything comes to education. So, and quality of education,
Well, and this, I'll say this is, yes, I'll just say one quick point that I believe that's one of the reasons why partnerships like the one that Indiana University has developed with many of our non-residential scholars is so important. I'll say that we have learned just as much, I'm sure, as our partners at 25 different universities in Ukraine have. We're learning more about where the intersections are in systems of education, where the disconnects are, and I'll just say that I hope that kind of collaboration can continue. I'll point out one thing that has really come through in many of the remarks today, and is also in the chat that Ivana Tsar has put, is that these discussions can't wait, right? It's too easy to say, well, it's wartime now, we can't talk about language, we can't talk about culture, we can't talk about X, Y, and Z. That's not going to work. We have to have a plan in place, like Nastya Melnychenko said, and that's just so important. So I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. Nadia Hanchorenko, please, you have a contribution. The floor is yours.
Дуже дякую. Я би хотіла таки наважилася кілька
Thanks a
думок.
lot. I was just waiting for a possibility to say a couple of things. Olena Stiazhkina said, and she talked about this discourse, this militarization discourse about Ukrainian nationalism that is being confused with Nazism. It's pretty much related to what Mr. Chernetsky said in his presentation today when he talked about injustice, epistemic injustice, even epistemic violence that is out there. It affects how Ukraine is presented in scientific discourse. And the other thing that I wanted to say, we all hope for our victory. And I can say about myself, I'm just happy that I did leave. I'm still in Ukraine. I'm still working here, and I'm thankful to a university program that supports me and allows me to um, do what I love. But I like to say that, yeah, we are pretty thankful every day, and we learned to express our gratitude to everyone, even people that we don't know, for being there, for trusting each other, because this is something that I've noticed. We have a lot of trust towards each other, and we became bolder, more courageous. And I think that everything that I mentioned, it will make sure that after we win, we will be able to solve other problems.
Thank you. I would like to invite our roundtable participants to offer any final thoughts that you have, anything that's new that's come up, or anything that you want to reiterate from the previous conversation. Unfortunately, our time together is coming to an end, and I just want to say what a privilege it has been to host this conference. And Indiana University is just very pleased that we were able to collaborate with all of you and make this 3-day conference happen. Larissa Kisluk, your hand was up and then it went down. Did you want to say something? You're more than welcome to.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to add that Ukraine requires representation as never before around the world. And first of all, I'm really thankful. I really appreciate your efforts. I am thankful to the University of Indiana and your team that represent Ukraine throughout the world. We really feel that help. And people who had to leave the country, they also carry out that mission, representing Ukraine, conveying cultural, historical messages. This is what we need to do. Ukraine needs to get its real history and culture back, not the post-colonial one, but the one that we really have. And I really wish that the world saw that culture, that it sees Ukraine not through just Chernobyl or war. I think Ukraine deserves more. having having this history of Kiev and Rus and being on the cutting edge of culture and science before it was destroyed by Soviet repressions and genocide. Now we have a chance to restore the country, and I believe that Ukrainians who are aware of that, they need to unite wherever you are. They need to join that historical missions of rebuilding Ukraine. And I'm being optimistic. And I'm still optimistic. And I've noticed on the conference that there are quite a lot of people working on these messages to tell the world about the real Ukraine. And this is what will or has to unite us after the war ends.
I want to echo what some of the thanks in the chat for our wonderful simultaneous interpreters. They have done an amazing job during this 3-day conference. Today we had Tatiana and Alexander interpreting, so thank you both so much. I do want to give our roundtable participants that chance to offer any final thoughts. We'll start with Victoria. If you could keep it to about a minute, that would be great. Sorry for the rush.
Yes. I'd like to say that I'm talking to you not from any place in Kharkiv, but from Slovo House, the apartment building that was built in the 20s for Ukrainian writers. At this conference, perhaps everyone knows about the executed Renaissance, so I don't have to tell the story because not everyone in the world knows yet. And I'd like to say that it would also be important for our victory and for the justice that we make sure that at least some of those writers are translated into English and other languages. Because right now I can see how people rush to write new books, etc., but we also have to make sure that the legacy is translated, and then there will be no questions anymore about whether Ukraine exists, because actually we have to make sure that this memory and this legacy is never erased in all the languages. Reinforcing the gratitude culture, I just would like to thank the Indiana University and my co-panelists, David, Olena, and Nastya, and to everyone here. And thank you very much. And of course, I'd like to thank the Ukrainian armed forces and even the electricians who heroically, risking their lives, repaired all the electrical facilities in Ukraine after the attacks on the infrastructure. That's why I'm able to speak to you from the Slovo House in Kharkiv. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. I'll also give a special shout out to Andriy Pasunko, who's one of our IU Ukraine non-residential scholars who is serving in the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Thank you, Andriy, for all that you do. I'm passing the word now to, I forgot who is David. It's David. You were next. Sorry.
Thank you. So what is happening, of course, in Ukraine right now is a miracle and an inspiration to the world. And Ukraine's greatest weapon, of course, aren't the tanks or the airplanes coming in. It's the goodness in the heart of Ukrainians and their resolution to build a better future. So it's a very easy country to fall in love with. And all of what you hope for, I believe, from other countries should be lining up, because right now, this is where the battle for civilization is being fought. And we can all only hope and pray that all of this unity, all of this fervor, all of this inspiration will continue into peacetime.
Thank you, David. Very well stated. Olena, Stiazhkina, your final comments.
Дякую дуже, колеги, вам всім.
Thank you so much to all of you for that great event and for your solidarity. It it's giving us wings, your solidarity, your faith, and your gratefulness. And yes, I'm thinking myself as that fragmented person from Donetsk, representing lots of people who left Ukraine back in 2014. Europe hasn't felt a real refugee crisis because these 2 millions were not refugees. We stayed at our home. And I want to be the last person in my family who speaks Russian. And I wish my children had never spoken Russian before, but that's their decision, but I will do all I can to make it happen. The formula for my optimism is the following. It's very simple. Either we win, or we die, or we're killed. And we're not in the position to choose. So my optimism is in
Паніки, депресії та відчаю. І останнє, з 2014
I could minister of the ministry of panic, and I'm not anymore. And wherever we are, whatever we do, we think about that. And I always say, and always finish my words with "See you in Ukrainian Donetsk." So I would like to say the same thing today. See you in Ukrainian Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea.
Thank you. Nastya, you have the final word on the round table.
Дякую дуже. Це дуже велика відповідальність.
Thanks a lot. That's a huge responsibility. Oh my God, it's very hard to come up with something. Because everyone who talked, they talked about important things. But I'll get back to my concerns.
Перемоги українське суспільство може бути розділене в чварах.
That Ukrainian society can be divided. And there were psychological research that acknowledge that people can overcome these challenges if they have a mission. Now, during that war, we have this mission. We need to survive. We need to overcome. This is what unites us. This is what keeps us united. What's going to happen after the victory? And Natalia Shulga was the right to say that we need the new society agreement or social agreement that will unite us. That's going to have that idea that we can move towards without failing. This will be some mission that will unite us. And I'm happy that we're having this discourse and this discussion where we can talk, where we can share our thoughts, and we can find the way to this uniting idea, to this new social agreement, to this new mission that will unite us. And another important thing we need to remember, even after the victory, there'll still be a threat, and we'll need to be ready to build the country even when this threat is still out there. Like in Israel, they're successful. They're continuing to build their country, and this will be the ultimate task for us. Thank you very much.
This has been an amazing roundtable, a fitting culmination of this conference, and can't wait to continue these conversations with all of you in new formats, different I don't know, ways and means, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks to everyone who participated in the Shevchenko conference. I'll repeat that this was, I guess we're done, the 4th annual Indiana University Taras Shevchenko conference, a tradition that was started by the Ukrainian Studies organization here at the university, which is a student-led organization. And it was Ani Abrahamyan and Natalia Shpilova Said, who almost 4 years ago now put on a wonderful conference. It took place in February 2020. For many of us, it was our last kind of in-person event before the pandemic, and we are just thrilled to be able to continue the conference, albeit in a virtual format. But as we see now, the virtual format allows us to come together in ways that we never knew were possible. So thank you to everyone. We will be sending notes out to everyone who registered and attended the conference. So please look forward to information from us about the conference presentation recordings, other events that will be taking place. Please take note that Russell Valentino put some information in the chat, and I followed up with a flyer about an upcoming event celebrating some new publications from Aerosmith Press. Really, really interesting. Hope you can all join us. It's been a wonderful 3 days. I want to thank Russell Valentino. I want to thank Svetlana Melnyk for helping organize the conference. Also Ani Abrahamyan and Natalia Shpilova-Said. And just дуже дякуємо, and hope to see you all again, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!